Welcome to Fellowship of the Cross podcast. I am Pastor Josh. This week's podcast: can we really partake in God's divine nature? Insights from 2 Peter 1:4.
Can we really partake in God's divine nature? Insights from 2 Peter 1 verse 4. Hey there! Have you ever wondered if it's possible for us to partake in God's divine nature? According to 2 Peter 1 verse 4, it is. In this blog, we'll dive into this verse and explore what it means for us as believers. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. 1. Introduction. Can we really partake in God's divine nature? Have you ever wondered if it's possible to partake in God's divine nature? According to 2 Peter 1 verse 4, it is. This verse tells us that through our faith in Jesus Christ, we have been given the opportunity to become partakers of God's divine nature. As believers, we have access to precious promises that allow us to experience the fullness of God's nature. However, sin has corrupted our ability to access this divine nature. But the good news is that we can take steps towards restoring our connection with God's nature. By living a life of faith, pursuing righteousness, and seeking to know God more intimately, we can experience the fullness of God's divine nature. So, let's take advantage of this incredible opportunity and strive to participate in the fullness of God's divine nature. 2. What does 2 Peter 1 verse 4 tell us about our relationship with God? 2 Peter 1 verse 4 tells us that through God's promises, we can partake in His divine nature. This means that as believers, we have the opportunity to experience and participate in the fullness of God's divine nature. This promise is precious and should be cherished by all believers. However, the corruption of sin has affected our ability to access this divine nature. We must take steps towards restoring a rightful connection with God's divine nature. This can be achieved through prayer, reading the Bible, and living a righteous life. By doing so, we can experience the joy and peace that comes with partaking in God's divine nature. It is important to remember that this is a lifelong journey and requires constant effort and dedication. But the rewards are immeasurable and will ultimately lead us closer to God. 3. Precious promises of divine nature for believers. As believers, we have access to precious promises of divine nature that are freely given to us by God. These promises are not just empty words, but they are a reflection of God's character and His desire to have a close relationship with us. In 2 Peter 1 verse 4, we are reminded that through His promises, we can partake in God's divine nature. This means that we can experience the same love, joy, peace, and goodness that is found in God. However, the corruption of sin has affected our ability to access this divine nature. Sin separates us from God and hinders our ability to fully experience His promises. But the good news is that we can take steps towards restoring our connection with God's divine nature. By confessing our sins, seeking forgiveness, and living a life that is pleasing to God, we can experience and participate in the fullness of God's divine nature. So let us hold fast to the promises of God, knowing that they are true and trustworthy, and let us strive to live a life that reflects the divine nature of our loving Father. 4. How the corruption of sin has affected our ability to access divine nature. As believers, we are promised the opportunity to partake in God's divine nature. However, the corruption of sin has greatly affected our ability to access this nature. Sin has separated us from God and tarnished our relationship with Him. We are no longer able to approach Him in the same way we once could. The corruption of sin has also affected our ability to understand and fully comprehend God's divine nature. We are limited by our own human nature and our sinful tendencies, but the good news is that through faith in Jesus Christ, we can begin to restore our connection with God's divine nature. As we turn away from sin and seek to live a life that is pleasing to God, we can begin to experience the fullness of His divine nature. It is a process that requires patience, perseverance, and a willingness to surrender to God's will. But the reward is immeasurable. Through our connection with God's divine nature, we can experience true joy, peace, and fulfillment in our lives. 5. Taking steps towards restoring a rightful connection with God's divine nature. Taking steps towards restoring a rightful connection with God's divine nature is a crucial aspect of our spiritual journey. As we learn from 2 Peter 1 verse 4, believers have been given precious promises of divine nature, but the corruption of sin has affected our ability to access it. However, this does not mean that we cannot take steps towards restoring our connection with God. One way to do this is through prayer and meditation, which allows us to quiet our minds and connect with God on a deeper level. Another way is through studying the Bible, which provides us with guidance and wisdom on how to live a life that is pleasing to God. Additionally, we can surround ourselves with other believers who can encourage and support us in our journey towards restoring our connection with God's divine nature. By taking these steps, we can experience and participate in the fullness of God's divine nature, which is a truly transformative experience. 6. Conclusion: experiencing and participating in the fullness of God's divine nature. In conclusion, it is possible for us to experience and participate in the fullness of God's divine nature. As we have seen from 2 Peter 1 verse 4, God has given us precious promises that enable us to partake in His divine nature. However, the corruption of sin has affected our ability to access this divine nature, and we must take steps towards restoring our connection with God. This includes confessing our sins, repenting, and seeking a deeper relationship with God through prayer, studying His Word, and fellowship with other believers. As we do so, we will begin to experience the transformative power of God's divine nature in our lives. We will become more like Him, and our lives will bear witness to His goodness and grace. So let us press on towards this goal, knowing that God has given us everything we need to partake in His divine nature and experience the fullness of His love and power.